We ready to chat?
Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is David Cunion. I'm the curator here at the New Orleans Jazz Museum. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I've had this idea to do this, and I'm really happy that the ladies have decided to come and talk and stuff. And because I had the idea once the book came out, that is called, I always get it wrong, How Women Made Music, that we needed to do something to promote it and to talk about it here, and especially during Women's History Month. All kind of comes together. Anyway, I'm going to get off the stage. Let me quickly introduce Melissa Weber, Allison Fensterstock, Gwen Thompkins, Jennifer Odell. Please give them a round of applause.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm going to also ask for or do some mini introductions that go a little bit further, but just to backtrack, we'll start over here. That Melissa is the curator of the Hogan Jazz Archive at Tulane, and you may also know her as Soul Sister for her fabulous her show on OZ, and also her events where you are going to hear more rare grooves and amazing funk music than you ever thought were even on the planet. And Allison Fensterstock, who is also a music historian and writer, journalist, and DJ, and was the editor of this book. And Gwen Thompkins, who I learned from the bio. I thought that I was going to say still Music Inside Out, which we all know and love, the fabulous program that ran on WWNO for many years. And but Gwen is now working on her PhD and working on a book about drawing from interviews from Music Inside Out, I understand. And Gwen and Melissa are two of the contributors to this incredible book, How Women Made Music. And I happen to really like the subhead, which is a revolutionary history, which I think is really important to how the book is organized and sort of how the information in there comes across. We'll start by talking, we'll start there, which is, and you'll be able to pick up a copy of your very own, not from Amazon, but from Lefty outside, if you don't have one yet, after this. But in the introduction, Ann Powers, your colleague at NPR, talks about how this book grew out of a series called Turning the Tables, and I'm going to ask Allison to tell a little bit more about that and how that project grew into this book.
Yeah, so Turning the Tables is a series that was started in 2017 on NPR Music, which is sort of the multimedia platform of NPR that focuses on music. It started as more of an online magazine. There's a lot of written stuff, as well as like podcasts and embedded videos and links and playlists and all the good like multi-platform stuff that is so helpful to writing about music. And Ann Powers is the chief critic for NPR Music, and our friend Jill Sternheimer, who was the co-founder of Turning the Tables, was the director of programming at Lincoln Center at the time. She was a concert promoter. So the two of them got together. Actually, like the origin story is that it was actually at the Ponderosa Stomp here in New Orleans, where I used to work as a programmer of events like this, not shows, but conversations. And they were there and they were watching Barbara Lynn. I don't know, do you guys know Barbara Lynn? It was the left-handed guitar player from Beaumont, Texas, who was maybe in her 70s when she became a Ponderosa Stomp regular. And you have these two experts. You have Anne, who's been writing about pop music for, since the 80s, and Jill, who's been putting on shows at Lincoln Center for decades, and before that at Newport Folk, and they just got their minds blown by this figure, like just up there, like front man, slinging the guitar. And they just started this ongoing conversation about, like, why haven't we heard of her? Like, where are the other women like her that we haven't heard of? Like, why don't we even hear about her on the sort of best-kept secret lists, And then, of course, that leads into, like, well, who else? Like, who else is out there that we haven't heard of, or who else hasn't gotten sort of celebrated in the appropriate way, or who else is always kind of a footnote? So with the power they had, they started Turning the Tables, which began as a written feature on NPR Music. This is like the really long version, but It was, they got together for that first season about 50 or 60 women and other non-male writers and broadcasters from public radio and the freelance music journalism world. And that included me and Gwen that year. And we voted and argued and you know, sent like nasty Slack messages and, until we came up with the first publication of Turning the Tables, which was the list of the 150 greatest albums by women in music. And then that led into a series of essays, like feature reporting stuff. I remember I did a really long piece about the women in the Grateful Dead industry, which is fascinating and was also like 5,000 words long, so it didn't make it in the book. And then we immediately like came back to the content of the list with a series called Shocking Omissions, which was everyone got to pick someone that was like, why didn't they make it on the list? That is bullshit. And they wrote a whole essay about that. And that went over so well, they just continued the umbrella Turning the Tables project to just be this series. It was kind of amorphous and evolved as it went along, that just tried to write a history of popular music, like mostly Anglophone, mostly Western, kind of rock focused, just without men, you know, just to kind of recenter, you know, like refocus the lens so that the women who are usually in the background and on the side and kind of, you know, higher up than number 10 on all the other lists, like, oh, like 500 greatest guitar players of all time. Okay, I guess Bonnie Raitt can be number 27. And that's like the first woman on the list. So it was just removing the men to see how the history looked. And as it turned out, as the series went on with a few other themed collections of writing, like there was one year where we focused entirely on artists that had made their first recording no earlier than 1999. That was like the crystal ball gazing series, where we were like, who do we think is gonna really shape the next century of pop music? Then there was a series where we went back in time, which I think Gwen can talk about more because she was on the voting body for that, which was the Foremothers and the Founders. It was 8 women who each got a ton of writing devoted to them that were all figures in gospel or traditional country or blues or early jazz that created the foundation for what became pop music. And, you know, as COVID started, I think that was the 4th season where we asked people to do like super, super deep listening essays and memoir and really like engage and dig into our relationships with albums and artists, which was, you know, it worked really well with all of that, like spending time locked inside with your headphones on. So it kind of went on and on. And there never seemed like there was, you know, we never seemed like we were touching the ocean floor here, right? It wasn't like you've gotten to the end of the women, like that's all the women, we're done. But in end of 2019, beginning of 2020, NPR decided to try to put it into book form, which of course couldn't include even everything from the Turning the Tables series. So that was sort of my task to cull and organize and make it make sense as one text. And I also got to dig into the NPR archives as a whole. Like this is everything going back to 1970. I got to talk to the archivists and just say like, can you see if you ever interviewed Chaka Khan? Like, can you find me Madonna? Like, what's in there? And I got to learn that from the very beginning of NPR, they were doing these really deep, thoughtful, long-form interviews with musicians. So there was also an incredible amount of material there to mine. And the important thing about that, I think, is that we got the artists' own voices into the book. So when you flip through the book, you'll see there are chunks where it's just an excerpt from like an interview that Joni Mitchell did with Leanne Hansen, where it's just Joni Mitchell talking about her process. So instead of a critic or a reporter, it's the artist themselves. And I think that makes for a really nice, eclectic interplay of voices in the whole text.
Yeah, there was something that I read, and now I can't remember, somewhere in all my notes here, it says what reviewer wrote this, but someone wrote that that it was like walking into a room full of great musicians and great music writers, and just like listening to the conversations that you kind of encountered. And it is actually exactly like that, and that it speaks to Allison's really thoughtful editing like there are a lot of people, myself included, who probably would have like erred on the side of too much information to connect A to B. But like if you just keep reading it and you see these different sort of patchwork sections, you see that they're not patchwork at all. That they are actually, each piece is so connected deeply to the next one and the next one, and you can read it. You can read it in chunks in like whatever you flip to. But if you read it in even if you read it from front to back, it's not a linear history in any sense. Like it keeps kind of moving around. And so to get to like what Gwen and Melissa contributed, for example, Gwen's first piece in there, I believe, is the Mahalia piece, which that must have been written specifically for this book?
No. It was written for the Turning the Tables.
Okay.
First season. Is that right? Or second season or something?
No, I think that was the third season. That was all the sort of pre-rock people.
Yes.
And
So that comes
Pre-rock.
in this. So and then the other great editing component of this book in my mind is the chapters, which I don't want to take up so much time that I read you every single chapter title, but so that falls in Tradition Bearers and Breakers, which has this fabulous opening. This is where Turning the Tables begins, with the mothers of rock and roll and the innovators who both echo and interrogate them now, showing that preservation is sometimes a demonstration of love and sometimes an act of protest. The roots are very much alive and talking to the leaves. And Gwen and other writers who contributed to that section really do a beautiful job of laying this foundation where you can see exactly that last sentence, how those roots are talking to these leaves, and then little bits and pieces of what you wrote about Mahalia come up throughout the rest of the book all the way to the end, which is so interesting to me. Can you talk a little bit about what else you contributed?
Oh,
Before I go on
yes,
and on
I
about
think
you.
I remember. Well, I really enjoyed writing that Mahalia piece, actually, and then I'm trying to remember. I think I did the first great album from Aretha Franklin, which was I Never Loved a Man, which really established her as at the beginning of a fantastic career. I mean, she had more than one career before that album came out as a gospel singer, and of course, doing sort of more traditional chanteuse work. She does. But when she did I Never Loved a Man, that was. That was her writing. That was her. It was, it's like, it makes you tremble to think about that much talent, showing itself. And I did. I also wrote. That's right. I also argued for and wrote Barbra Streisand. During her rock and roll period. And I remember talking to Ann Powers about this because she's, Ann was very diplomatic, and she called me up and she said, "So." Why Barbra Streisand? And I said, well, pop music. The beauty of pop music and rock and roll is that you have to think about it as a giant room where there are no walls really. There are just lots of doors. And people take a lot of doors into rock and roll. If you interview enough musicians, you'll find out some started off in classical, some started off in doing something completely different, and they entered into rock and roll or pop music even through those doors. And so here's a woman who came through musical theater, essentially, and with a hell of a voice, and who felt like she had something to say in this arena, and it was fascinating to look into her life and see her as a risk taker, and to also bring home the idea that I've never met a musician who says I only do this. You know what I mean? Most musicians get very, very touchy when you try to throw a label on them, and so for Streisand, it seemed logical that she should be in there, and thank God listened, and so I wrote that piece. Yes.
And Melissa's fabulous piece about the women of Parliament, Funkadelic. So those pieces all come from a sort of different perspective. Like I feel like the Mahalia Jackson almost reads like a literary theory piece in some ways, whereas the Aretha and Barbara pieces are more like kind of what
Right.
kind of like what we're used to hearing from you as far as from you, the music journalist. And Melissa's, I love the diversity of voices and approaches to writing all of these different. They're not necessarily homages. Some of them are, but some of them are something different. Melissa's piece is really special and really different from a lot of the other things because it is such a history lesson, and at the same time, it's so personal. And can you talk a little bit about what you wrote?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, credit to Allison as editor
Yes.
for seeing me and bringing me into this, because she saw, and we've known each other in spaces from my work as a historian and a writer, and I touch a lot of different spaces, as you mentioned, being curator of the Hogan Archive of New Orleans Music and New Orleans Jazz at Tulane University Special Collections. I also teach a history of urban music course at Loyola University, and my personal hobby is DJ Soul Sister, where I do a lot of things on stage and on radio. But this piece represents none of that. It represents me doing personal research that started when I was an undergraduate in college. And now I'm AARP age, so a long time ago. And I was trained as a journalistic writer, so when you do that, you learn to never put yourself into it. It has to be objective and fact-based. And I knew if I wanted to tell this short remembrance and elegy to the women of Parliament Funkadelic, I had to put myself in it, because I came to my love and knowledge of the women of Parliament Funkadelic from being a webmaster of a P-Funk webpage in the mid-90s when the World Wide Web first popped up. And I was dealing, and this page was so popular with the Funketeers, the Parliament Funkadelic fans, most of them, I'd say 99% of them men, and they could tell you every man, every musician, male musician who so much as tapped the cowbell on a P-Funk song, when it came to the women, nobody cared. And they let you know so. And I never forgot that. At that time, it made me want to dig deeper even then. So this piece is like the full circle of me thinking about those questions way back in the mid-1990s and having that anger starting back then. Why are they invisible? Why does no one want to say their name? Why does no one care?
Yeah,
Why don't I know as a Parliament Funkadelic fan? So,
why aren't they among the you said 16, there were 16 musicians who, when Parliament Funkadelic was inducted into the Rock Hall of Fame, there were 16 musicians, not one of whom was among the many women who not only were central to the sound, but like got spin-off groups because they were so important to that sound.
and a lot of us feel like, and I'm very close with, I've remained close with Parliament Funkadelic life, right, over the years. So when I say a lot of us, I mean fans, associates, members, family, you name it, feel that Malia Franklin, who we call the Queen of Funk, should have been included because of what she brought to the table, not solely as a vocalist or a member, but she introduced George Clinton to Bootsy Collins. She introduced George Clinton to Judy Morrison. She brought in so many integral musicians. And when you think about the pairing, the songwriting pairing of George Clinton and Bootsy Collins, so many of those hits, I can't imagine P-Funk without those hits, which Bootsy helped to write. It's like thinking of the Beatles without Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Malia Franklin brought so much to that nucleus. George Clinton is one of my greatest influences. And what I love about him is that he'll be the first to say, absolutely. And he gave Malia Franklin at the end, the tail end of the final Parliament album of what we call this Parliament period from 1974 through 1980, the final album on Casablanca Records called Trumbibulation. The final song has this long solo from Malia Franklin. No woman in P-Funk had ever gotten a solo. So I just want more people to know her name and all of their names and why they're important, right? A song like Atomic Dog by George Clinton, which was a solo release in 1982. Why is there panting, dog panting? Because Malia Franklin told everyone to start panting. And I tell that story in my piece.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Okay, so George Clinton has no one asked George Clinton who should be considered to be in the inner circle of Parliament when the decision was made to put Parliament up for a vote for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
That I don't know, but what I do know is Parliament Funkadelic is, the nickname is the Funk Mob. There's so many members. So, they could only choose a small member. There's probably 50 people who could have been inducted. The decisions behind that, I don't know. But that's why I'm glad that we can tell our stories. And I also do want to cite that Dawn Silva, who was a member of the Brides of Funkenstein and a member of Parliament Funkadelic, she released her memoir a few years ago. And then Malia Franklin's son, Seth Neblett, he has a book, an oral history with several of the women of Parliament Funkadelic coming out this fall. So more and more stories are being told, but before, people weren't even thinking of women of Parliament Funkadelic. When you think Parliament Funkadelic, you think men. When you think funk, you think men. Now we have a different story to add.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, the way you were telling part of her story, is that's authorship. I mean, that panting is so distinct. Like, everyone knows that song, everyone knows that sound, or just the introductions she was making, like, all of these roles, they're essential, and it's an authorship of the sound that we find so familiar, and it somehow felt okay for so long to just be like, well, she's just one of the ladies. I mean, it's
one of the ladies, yes.
And
I think one of those people in the mid-90s may have written just that quote.
And this book has a lot more than, there are a lot more, many different kinds of artists and songwriters and performers in here besides just vocalists, but there is this sort of pernicious, like, just to be a vocalist is not really musicianship that really dogs women in particular.
Definitely.
Yeah, well, and I was going to also ask you to talk about some of the things that you wrote for the book, because you didn't just do the editing. One of which was it just was it an interview, or was it was an interview with Terry Lynn Carrington?
Oh yeah.
So you also a number of your pieces were kind of focused on the 60s stuff that you're interested in. Those of you who are not obsessed with Allison's writing like I am, so Irma Thomas was included in The Shocking Omissions, which Someone Will Care, which is a beautiful piece. Bobby Gentry, you wrote about the Shangri-Las and Leader of the Pack. You included an interview you did with Ani DeFranco just a couple of years ago about called We're Really Gonna Sing About This, which was getting on stage and singing about having an abortion, and that's not just like that's not just a choice that women go out like, I want to go out and do this thing. Like, it's hard and scary. And anyway, but the instrumentalist who comes to mind in that group of the ones that you contributed would have been Terry Lynn. Partially comes to mind because I was surprised, because I know you're not the biggest jazz head.
I know.
And I was like, oh, look at this.
No, and that was also, I have to admit, Terry was part of the early part of Turning the Tables. That was I think it was for three years in a row. Anne and NPR, and then Jill and Lincoln Center collaborated on these reviews at Lincoln Center that featured either artists that were in the book or in, the season we had just done, or artists performing the songs of people who were featured in the season we had just done, like that first year of the 150 greatest albums, that second year of everyone who started recording in the 21st century, and that third year of, the originators and foremothers who, none of them were around, but they put together tributes to them. And that was the year that Terry Lynn was the band leader. For
She's
that
also a
review.
drummer, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted,
Oh,
just in case you all didn't know, she's a jazz drummer.
She's got like
Yes.
3 Grammys now, and she runs, it's a new section of Berklee College of Music, which I think is the Institute for Gender and Justice, which really it deals with like gender disparity in studying jazz, which is a genre that's like, especially masculine in its population, and she's sort of working on why that is, and shifting it and creating more opportunities for women and other people who aren't men sort of on those stages and in those worlds. And that interview was something that we decided to do specifically for the book. So that was not my secret, jazz fluency, which...
There's another interview or snippet with her in there where she talks about something that I've spoken with her about too in the past, about her Mosaic project, where she sort of corralled a lot of women musicians and then spoke repeatedly in the press about like, and you know what, this was a great project and I'm really proud of it. And I also learned that like diversity is valuable, and that like this was out of balance, I think is the phrase she used in the piece that you included here, which brought me to think about something that one thing that really strikes me about the book is like it does such a good and not clobbering you over the head version of getting at kind of the intersectionality of just all these issues that artists are humans, and humans experience things, and the things bump into each other, and they overlap, and like and it's probably connected to the women being inspired, people being inspired by one another. Those things also overlap, and I thought you did a really good job of finding things, finding pieces that came together in ways that complemented the pieces would complement one another, again, like to get back to the roots are alive and talking to the leaves or whatever. Could you talk a little bit about the way that you chose to organize the book, and if that has something to do with the inclusion of the word revolutionary history, which I really like, apparently?
Yeah, I mean, the organization that came from like the first memo I got from NPR, and one of the only actual like instructions or suggestions I got from them. I was sort of very surprised at how much I was let loose in the archives to just do this, which was terrifying and really fun. But I think this was a suggestion from Anne or from Marissa LaRusso, who's another editor at NPR Music that worked very heavily on Turning the Tables, was to organize the work thematically instead of chronologically or by genre. Which also, I mean, like for one practical reason, that makes it less glaringly obvious how much we couldn't include.
But then at the end, like the pieces, so many of them come from these lists that are the blah, blah, blah greatest, I'm sorry, I'm really bad with numbers,
No, yeah.
the X number greatest albums made by women, or the 8 most influential pop music. There are a bunch of lists that are those kind of typical things, and so then it's like it automatically, when you get to the byline, especially for someone like me who's like anxiously waiting for the byline, it brings you back to like the timeline, and it kind of keeps going back and forth, and also in a circle, which I thought was rare.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of an intent to throw people out of time and out of genre so that they couldn't cheat and like only read the section about country music, or say like, I don't care about anything that was made after 1985. But it was also, like you said, it was sort of this experiment with the intersectionality of art, where if you looked at an organizing tool as not, hip hop and not the 30s, but, storytellers or like emotionally intense artists, and you put people from like vastly different genres and vastly different scenes and times together, you could see how they were approaching like the same problems to solve, you know, or they were dealing with the same issues in their lives with their art. And they did it so differently, but they had so much in common.
Yeah.
So it was hopefully like a way to make connections and make little sparks.
And I guess in the same thread, sort of, wanted to ask you guys, Melissa and Gwen, if there was anything. Obviously, your pieces were written for different reasons, whether it was, you know, for one of those lists or for the book or whatever. But is there anything that you could share about kind of how the context of writing any of those pieces affected the way you looked at the subjects you were writing about, or maybe changed what conclusions you drew?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm just going. But no, that's a really great question because each of the essays did require, you know, a specific kind of research, and I like to know as much as I can. And what you know, particularly the Mahalia piece, I really liked because it made me get in my car, drive to the neighborhood where she lived, walk around, you know, see the scale of it, because it's Black Pearl, it was not called Black Pearl back then. It was called, you know, N-word town. And but everyone who lived there, or so many people who lived there, who were of varying races back when she lived there, would say that word doesn't mean what you think it means. You know what I mean? That you know what I mean? That word, which we see in the 21st century as, you know, a pretty shocking word to name a neighborhood, but for the residents was not, it meant something else, or it meant something broader. But, you know, there is no substitute for getting off your butt and going someplace and standing in the place where the artist lived or breathed, or, you know what I mean, experience their, you know what I mean, these extraordinary emotions that fed their work. And to walk by her church, you know what I mean, which was so important to her, and which she visited and performed at the height of her career, actually, you know, for national television and all of this, was really lovely. And then to knock on doors and to talk with people who are like, oh yeah, you know, I'm her second cousin, or oh yeah, you know, she knew my mother, you know, this kind of thing. And so, you know, that's the beauty of living in an old town. And that's, of course, the beauty of living in New Orleans, where, you know, this stuff, you know, this information, this world is not at all distant from you, you know. And, you know, I'm just about to drive after this. I'm going to go up Melpomene because Ricky Riccardi, you know, the Louis Armstrong biographer, he has located a residence that still exists on Melpomene where Louis lived that nobody knew at all, and has never, you know, but that Louis describes in his memoirs. And this is the residence where he lived with his first wife, Daisy Parker, and his cousin Clarence, this little boy who he took care of for Clarence's entire life. And Clarence was born without any disability, but they lived on the second floor of this building on Melpomene, and Clarence fell down the stairs and was never the same again. And so, you know, and I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I mean, I can go and see this? You know, so I'm going to go see this, so you might want to follow me, right, on the way home. Or, you know, I was reading Searching for Buddy Bolden, you know, the Don Marquis book, and he's talking about, like, where Buddy Bolden's remains were brought after he died at Jackson, at the mental institution in Jackson, and they're, you know, it's the Getty's funeral home. It's right there on Jackson Avenue, you know what I mean? Right. So, you know, it's amazing how wherever you lay your hand, there is, you know, enough information and enough of a roux, so to speak, to you know, and a keyhole into understanding the city and into understanding musical history. You know, what I mean, so much more deeply than we do before we lay our hand down. you know. So I guess that's all I have to say about it, but it's titillating and fabulous, you know what I mean?
Actually, just made this is a tangent, but I wanted to ask both of you now because you both grew up in New Orleans. So, did you do that when you were a kid, like growing up and learning about this music? Did you go out and look for the places? Because that's something after when I moved to New Orleans for college, it kind of blew my mind over and over again. Like as you were saying, that all these places are still there, and you can like ride your little bicycle over and take a look. And when I was a teenager in New York City, I did want to do that, but like so much, gets knocked down in New York City. Like so much is gone and disappeared and changed. And, you could go to CBGB's and kind of squint at it. But so I also find that really special about New Orleans in particular. Like, were you kind of mapping out in real life?
To answer that is sort of like musicians or artists or creators. When you're doing it, you're doing it. You're not thinking about it. So back then, no, but today, I hear about things, events, or places, and then I think back, oh yeah, I know where that was. But at the time, you're just at the party. You're not like, this will be history in 20 years. That's how I think about it.
I don't know. I think when I was much younger, just seeing the artist in situ, like just seeing them walk down the street, going to Piku's Bakery and thinking, Professor Longhair could walk in at any moment, at 4 a.m. or whatever, and seeing him was really exciting, and so now, I think now I just drive whenever I go around the town. I think just like everybody else, I'm sure, New Orleans is so well known for. That ain't here no more, but, giving tours to people to tell them what used to be there, But, just like when you're driving up, is that Louisiana Avenue, and you cross over, what street is that? Britannia, and right there is, I think, a little bank.
Oh,
but
it's the donut shop.
It used to be the donut shop, and that's where Earl King used to hang out, you know what I mean, with his buddies. And so every time I drive by, I'm thinking, hey, Earl King, And so I find that, and somebody else said this, so I'm not saying anything new, but I find that whenever you start is the right time. You know what I mean? Like looking for these places, and whenever you start, you have to realize you will never stop. You will always be interested in these things. You will always want to go find these places, and every time you walk by them or bicycle by them or whatever, you will still acknowledge them as you go by. And I think that is. The joy of living in this town or in any town that's a great musical town.
Yeah. I want to give both of you guys also a chance to. I'm so aware of saying how much I say guys now. If you have anything that you wanted to add as far as writing within this context, sort of looking at how women made music in this. Obviously, when you wrote most of those pieces, if not all of them, Allison, those were focused on those lists that you were specifically doing. So it wasn't this book, but how did the context of what you were being asked to write or asking yourself to write, and as the case may have been, shape or impact what you came out with, or did it?
I guess, well, yeah, because I think everything, I didn't write anything new for this book. Like everything of mine that I put in there came from a different season of Turning the Tables, which had its own rules.
But those are
and
also
structure.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, that's like the interesting thing, which all of us as music writers know what it's like to write a million blurbs. The blurb format, that little 150 words. And that's what the lists were. And in doing this particular project of blurbs, it was interesting to think about, like, this is going to be in a context of, the greatest albums by women in music. So what is important to get into those 150 words? And that was interesting to see how my brain would decide, to solve the puzzle or come up with the punchline. And with the Shangri-Las and the Ronettes, who were like two of my favorites of all time that I was really happy to get for the 150 list, I realized so much of what was important to me about their legacy and that was so impressive was the breadth of their influence and just like, you know, knowing that like there was a time when like the Rolling Stones were the kings of the world, and like, you know, everyone would do everything they said, and like no one would say no, and they were like lordly, you know, entities on high, and the only people that would make them like blush and stammer and like drool were the Ronettes. And it was not because they were so, you know, gorgeous, although they were. It was like the music. It was that sound. It just blew their minds. It knocked them over. And there's so much of that. I mean, there's so much of that in the literature that they've said. And then when you sort of go back and look at the history of when the Ronettes first hung out with the Stones, and it's such a pivotal time. And I was like, the history of rock and roll in the 60s is like, without the Ronettes, it would not be there. And then you have the Shangri-Las, which are almost as impactful on punk rock. Like, you would not have the New York Dolls without the Shangri-Las. You wouldn't have the Ramones without the Shangri-Las.
Right.
So,
and which is not because they were women, it's because they were good.
because they were badass, yeah. So those were two things I remember that was exciting about doing pieces for
Yeah.
this that wound up in the book.
Melissa, did you have anything that came to mind?
Yeah. Writing the piece made me revisit and relive some of that energy I was going through corresponding with the male Funketeers back during that mid-90s period, and thinking of their questions, you know, why, and putting them in today, because sometimes I still see these comments pop up today. Why the women, they were not really in the band. And as an archivist, knowing the power of primary sources, and I now have more vernacular and expertise, experience, wisdom than I did at 18 and 19 when I did this website. I can say, look at the photographs. Look at the concert footage. On YouTube, you don't have to even pay for to have access. It's there. Look on the liner notes. The proof is there. Also, there's this common trope, this common conversation, and you spoke to this about women as singers. Well, the voice is an instrument.
Thank you.
The voice is an instrument, and real hardcore Parliament Funkadelic fans know, and George Clinton is the leader of that universe. George Clinton comes out of doo-wop, which is vocal. The power of the Parliament Funkadelic sound is the blend of vocals. Without vocals, no P-Funk. There you have it.
There you
So
go.
I can communicate that today, whereas back then, I couldn't communicate that.
Right. You just made me think of, I'm sure you guys remember, it was sort of a viral social media phenomenon when someone made a video clip just isolating Mary Clayton's vocals from Gimme Shelter.
Yeah.
And it's just, you know, it makes like your hair
Terrifying.
stand on end.
right.
And when you hear that, you're like, that was not just some session lady that was the luck of the draw. Like that is authorship of that song. That song would not be the same. Like, she is a Rolling Stone.
It's true, but then she's also a New Orleanian, you know what I mean, Mary Clayton, who was, as a child, was held and you know, cooed over by Mahalia Jackson.
Oh,
Yeah.
coming full circle.
It comes full circle. I interviewed her when her album came out right after her terrible accident and all, and she was talking about that, about Mahalia. So isn't it interesting how it all works? But you know, I'm just going to say this, and which is, you know, in school, I've been reading this book, which is such a good book, called The Women's Fight. And it's written by a historian named Favolia Glymph, which is a mouthful.
That's a great name.
Favolia Glymph, who used to be the head of the American Historical Association. And this is a book about women during the Civil War. And she's got a chapter on all kind, you know what I mean, on, you know, northern white women, on southern black women, on poor white women in the South, on wealthy white women in the South. I mean, she explodes the notion that you can categorize people just by saying women or just by saying South or North. You know what I mean? Because there are a lot of Unionists who lived in the South. There are a lot of Confederates who lived in the North, you know, that sort of thing. And it is such a good book because it pretty much does what this book does. It shows history and this war from the perspective of women whose homes were becoming part of the battlefields often, but who also were put on the road because their homes became part of the battlefield, and who walked through the South as if it were a state of nature, because it was, looking for a new reality, a safe harbor. And white and black, rich and poor, people, wealthy women having babies in the bush, you know what I mean? Poor black women having babies in the bush. There's all sorts of things. It's a good book, The Women's Fight, right? And so when you think about this book and the fact that it uses the term revolutionary, you know, it is revolutionary because this is a war. I mean, art is art, and part of art is, I mean, it's quite beautiful and aesthetic and everything, but another part of it is this war of ideas and this war between people who want to be in the story, and they want to make their contribution, and they want to have that contribution to have some kind of effect on the world. That's what the artist wants, right? And so it's a very apt description. And years ago, I'm going to wind this up. Years ago, I remember being in Sudan, of all places, right? In southern Sudan, where at that time, it was before that nation split up. And at that time, you know, there were an awful lot of people who had led a civil war, the southern Sudanese who had led the civil war, who were now in government. And I went to see this woman who was one of the top leaders of government in that region. And she said, you know, whenever people ask me about women in the civil war of Sudan, they try to minimize the role of the women. Oh, that woman was just a woman. The man had the gun. And she says, but the truth of the matter is, if you made food for that man, if you provided care for anyone who was in that war, whatever you did in that war to succeed, to survive, makes you a soldier in that war. And so, you know what I mean, there should be no distinction between, you know what I mean, what this man did and what this woman did, because we could not have gotten here apart, you know. And so I've never forgotten that. And so when I saw the title of the book, it made me remember it all over again. And it really, I thought, was sort of something that needed to be said in the conversation, you know.
Yeah, that also, now I'm going to have to, poke around in here to find it, but Melissa's piece ends with this incredible line that I know I shouldn't read the kicker because that's like, but hopefully you'll forget because I talk too fast anyway. But at the end of your piece, you talk about, you conclude that women weren't just members in the line of the P-Funk Army, they were generals leading the troops. And it's like,
that was very apropos.
Yeah. Anyway, apparently it's very moving to me. There are all these things. I want to ask one more question that is big and obnoxious and probably nobody wants to deal with, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and then we'll see if any of y'all have any questions. Which is, I just feel like we have to acknowledge the fact that, you know, in the last couple of weeks, we're watching the voices and roles of women and other marginalized Americans' contributions to American culture be literally erased from. Okay, fine, it's just government websites for now, but it's not, because it's also, of course, funding and education and who knows what else is coming. But is there? Don't feel compelled to answer this question because I know it's all very exhausting for probably everybody in this room. But like, is there what can we learn from this book about talking about these issues in a way that helps us look at the question of marginalized people's roles and contributions as part of a bigger, to me it's like, I forget whose quote I was that I mentioned earlier, but part of this this bigger fabric of, you know, Terry Lynn, who says that it's like, no, it's not like if you just take what that anybody's saying, if we just have the women over here, you know, that's one aspect of, or to me, that's one thing that we can take from this conversation that this book brings about into larger discussions about the dangers of erasing voices and erasing contributions. What else?
I mean, you have to just keep putting people's stories in the spotlight. You have to keep putting them out there. This is like another mini tangent, but there are definitely a lot of people who feel like we are past the time of segregating out women as a group, and that's kind of marginalizing. And books like this sort of, like, we're past the time for that. It should just be like the history of how people made music. And I think like we can't get to that point without books like this, because if you try to do everyone, there's all kinds of natural biases that still exist, and just like the snowball of bias that created history, which is like, if people don't get the opportunity to do the thing, then they won't be in the list of the best people to do the thing. Or if the industry and the infrastructure around the thing is set up to minimize them, then they won't get, their correct place in the thing. So you kind of do have to create these almost false structures to create correctives in the historical record. And also both of you are historians, and archivists, so I should let you talk more about how to do that in a practical sense.
Well, I just posted about this today on Facebook, as a matter of fact. I love to speak to the power of archives, and they can erase our stories from the websites and here and there, but what cannot be erased are primary sources. So it is up to us to document our own stories, tell your own story, get your friends to tell the stories, books, oral histories, record on your phone memo, photographs. If we didn't have primary sources for Parliament Funkadelic, anyone could have said they were just the background vocalists. We have the photographs. There's several photographs, publicity photos, issued by the record company from the mid to late 70s that include 2, 3, 4 of the women members. So nobody can say, oh, they were just on the tour. Or they just say, no, they were included in the visual imagery for the public, included in the band. And it didn't say Parliament featuring the ladies. It said Parliaments on the bottom. So archives matter. That's how I feel.
That's certainly true. I don't know. I be loud. I think like one of my favorite album titles is a Branford Marsalis album. I heard you twice the first time, and I love that. Just make people hear you twice the first time, in whatever capacity you have. I mean, the truth of the matter is, it's nice when people give you your flowers. It's nice when people acknowledge your work. But at the same time, you just got to do the work, and it will be found. You know what I mean? If you do it, and so the key there is to it sounds like a civil rights. Well, it was a civil rights slogan. Don't let nobody turn you around. The thing is, if you are going to be cowed by this, then maybe you're not an artist. If you're in, if you want to say you're an artist, if you are an artist, be an artist. That's it.
Yeah. Great. Did any of you all have any questions you'd like to ask? Oh, David's got a mic for you.
It's the second time I've held a microphone this week. First time ever was Wednesday. You're on a roll. Am I holding it correctly? Okay, great. Thank you all. I'm really thrilled to be able to be in your company, to listen to your stories. I think it's marvelous. I was going to ask also about the current political climate and how it's going to affect, because it feels so important that this book be written and be shared right now, because it feels like a lot of history is just being eradicated or fearful of that. And I just wondered, doing some just research on my own, just because I'm fearful about what's currently happening, I kind of miss the fact that I don't think or I'm not hearing in my world at least, very many songs, very much music right now that's kind of speaking to what's happening in this world right now. And I wondered if maybe you're connected in ways that I'm not, or how do we encourage artists who I am not to be able to do that, because I think it's a way of rallying. Just as you said, that song that you was perfect for our current time and day. So that was my first question.
No, it's a really good question. I mean, one of the chapters in the book it's like one of the most straightforwardly organized, I think. A lot of them are very squishy. There's one chapter that's about music in political activism and advocacy, and it's, like songs that you would either, like songs that are literally about political causes, or songs that we know historically were part of political events that were inspirational to people who were marching or gathering. And that was the one that evolved the most in real time. We had a new essay by a young Native artist about Ray Zaragoza, about what it was like to go to Standing Rock to protest. And then the songs she wrote, I think she wrote 2 songs about that experience, and brought one of them back to the pipeline with her. And she wrote about what it was like to sing to the people that were working on the ground. Like Gwen was saying, like if you sing a song to the medic in the tent,
Thank you.
like you're fighting the war. And that Ani DeFranco interview that I did that was new for the book was Roe v. Wade got overturned in the middle of the process of doing this book. And I was like, oh, like, shit, we need something about that. We need something about songs and reproductive rights. And Ani DeFranco has written abortion songs she wrote, I think, one when she was like 19 when I was first listening to her, and she wrote one when she was like 50. And I was like, I need to sort of talk to this person who has been able to express this really intimate thing in her art at such different points in her life. So I guess that is kind of rambly, but I feel like people are still doing that work. I'm maybe not tuned in enough to the young to know what, like,
the young. I think you're younger than me. I don't know if you're the youngest one.
I'm not that much younger.
Either of you folks who spend a lot of time in the world of the young college?
Young.
TikTok?
Not really. I mean, honestly, I ask my students for help on their music, so I'm not a good candidate to answer.
But
I'm still listening to my 70s
no,
and 80s
but something that we
LPs.
should all be paying attention to. So.
But the truth of the matter is, there is no substitute for time, right? For people who are really feeling the anxieties of the moment, it seems like it's going on forever. But the truth of the matter is, it really hasn't been that long, time-wise. So people have to be given time to understand what's happening. Sometimes you don't even know what you're looking at, right? Before you can have a response to that. You know what I mean? So no social movement, no socially relevant music, ever really, it just comes up like that. You know what I mean? It takes time. And so you have to let that natural process happen. And before you know it, something will happen. It's like I was talking to my friend earlier today. She's another journalist. And I was saying that, I remember interviewing a guy who was a boxer. And he said, that the best advice for a boxer is like when you're in the ring and you are being pummeled, like a combination. I mean, look at me. Like, obviously, I do not box, right? But you're being pummeled, right? In the face, and it's really hard. Then he says, what your coach, your trainer tells you is to remain poised if you can, because the truth of the matter is, it feels like it's going to go on forever. But pummeling is a very energy-sapping task, right? So nobody can pummel you forever, right? Which is what Muhammad Ali showed with George Foreman, you know what I mean, in Zaire, right? But, you know what I mean? So what may feel like it's going on forever inside, actually in temporal form is actually, in a blink, right? And if you can make it through that rally, that salvo, whatever it's called, then, you know what I mean, you can respond. You know what I mean? But when you're being pummeled at that very moment, your only job is to remain as poised and composed as you can, and to, you know what I mean, and to await a slackening. Then you have your chance. You see what I mean? So, you know what I mean? So I think that, you know, we have to draw wisdom from wherever we can to understand that there are cycles, and even things that appear irrational and unnatural, still everything has to ultimately bow to the rhythm of nature and the rhythm of time, you know, and all. And so, you know, whatever music you're listening to that you like right now is the music that you should be listening to, right?
Speaking of the rhythm of time, I see David creeping up.
Nice.
Before he thanks us, I would like to, and also speaking of what we're talking about here, which is, you know, like museums losing their funding, let's also be sure to thank David and Travis and Danny back there for having us and for this discussion. And now you're allowed to talk.
We also need to thank the Friend of the Cabildo, who are the sponsor of this. Thank you, Jason, and all the folks over there. These folks are not only my friends, but anytime I hear them talk or talk to them, their brilliance astounds me. So give it up for them, please. We will be doing more of this, and we do have to go, but that doesn't mean we should stop talking about this amongst ourselves or after this down there, but we got to kind of clear the stage and stuff like that. So one more time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was really
So
fun.
interesting.